Most people have a jar of cloves sitting in their spice cabinet right now. It's been there for 2 years. They use it once a year, maybe at Thanksgiving, and that's it. Just a spice, just a flavor thing. But here's what's interesting. Cloves are one of the most pharmacologically active plants ever studied. The concentration of beneficial compounds in a single clove is higher than almost any other food you could name, including things like blueberries and green tea that get all the health headlines. And something specific happens when you consume them consistently, especially after 50, when your body's inflammatory response, blood sugar regulation, and cellular repair mechanisms have all started to shift. We're going to go through what those changes actually look like, what the research shows, and exactly how 2 cloves a day, just 2, can quietly start moving things in the right direction. Let's get into it. So before we get into what cloves actually do, let's talk about what's happening in the body after 50, because that context is what makes all of this relevant. There's a process that researchers now call inflammaging. It's exactly what it sounds like, chronic, low-grade inflammation that builds gradually as we age, not the kind of inflammation that shows up when you sprain an ankle and your body sends a repair crew. This is quieter than that. It's a kind of background noise in your immune system that never fully switches off. And it's now understood to be a primary driver behind most of the things people associate with getting older. Joint stiffness, slower recovery, fatigue that doesn't make sense given how much sleep you're getting, cognitive fog, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and metabolic disorders. Here's the part most people miss. Inflammaging isn't inevitable. It's not just the clock ticking. It's driven by specific, measurable things. What you eat, how you move, what your gut microbiome looks like, how much oxidative stress your cells are under, which means it's also something you can actually influence, not eliminate, but meaningfully dial back. And this is where cloves come in, because the primary active compound in cloves, Eugenol, is one of the most potent natural anti-inflammatory and antioxidant substances identified in the research literature. When you consume cloves regularly, you're introducing something into your system that directly addresses the oxidative stress and inflammatory signaling that drive inflammaging. It's not a supplement engineered in a lab. It's something humans have been using for thousands of years, and the science explaining why it works has only gotten clearer. Now, 2 cloves sounds almost too small to matter, and I get that skepticism. I'd have it too. But this is actually one of those cases where the dose is genuinely modest because the potency is so high. You're eating 2 cloves because that's all you need. The concentration of eugenol and other active compounds is that significant even in a small amount. So let's talk about what consistently consuming that amount actually does, because the effects show up in some places you'd expect, and a few you probably wouldn't. Let's start with the one that surprises people most, blood sugar regulation. This isn't the first thing people think of when they think of cloves, but the research on this is actually some of the strongest in the whole cloves literature. Eugenol and another compound called nigericin, both found in cloves, have been shown to improve insulin sensitivity and enhance the uptake of glucose into cells. What that means in plain language is that cloves help your body use blood sugar more efficiently. Less of it stays floating around in your bloodstream, and more of it gets pulled into your cells where it belongs. There was a study published in the Journal of Medicinal Food. They had participants take a clove extract supplement daily for 30 days and measured their fasting blood sugar and insulin levels before and after. The results showed meaningful reductions in fasting glucose and improved insulin response compared to the control group. And this matters enormously after 50 because insulin sensitivity naturally declines with age. It's one of the quiet mechanisms behind energy crashes, stubborn weight gain around the midsection, and that foggy, sluggish feeling that a lot of people just accept as normal. Now, you're not replacing diabetes medication with cloves. Let me be clear about that. But as a daily habit that supports your metabolic function, particularly if you're in that pre-diabetic or insulin-resistant range that a lot of adults over 50 are in without knowing it, this is a genuinely meaningful addition. The second thing that happens, measurable reduction in inflammation markers. We talked about inflammaging, that chronic background inflammation that drives so much of what we associate with aging. Well, cloves directly target some of the key molecular pathways involved in that process. Specifically, Eugenol inhibits something called NF-κB, a protein complex that essentially acts as an on switch for inflammatory gene expression. When NF-κB gets activated, it triggers a cascade of inflammatory signals throughout the body. Eugenol interrupts that cascade. Now stay with me here because I know that got a little technical. Here's what it means practically. In studies where researchers measured C-reactive protein, that's a blood marker for systemic inflammation, people consuming cloves regularly showed lower levels. Less inflammation circulating in the system. And lower CRP is associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, better joint health, and slower cognitive decline. These aren't small things. These are the exact mechanisms that determine how well you age. Third, and this one connects to something almost everyone over 50 is dealing with, digestive health. Cloves have a long history in traditional medicine as a digestive aid, and the modern research backs up why. They stimulate the production of digestive enzymes, which become less robust as we get older. They have antimicrobial properties that help maintain a healthier balance of gut bacteria. And they reduce gastric irritation, bloating, gas, that uncomfortable heaviness after meals that a lot of people in their 50s and 60s just assume is normal now. I talked to someone not long ago. She was in her mid-60s, had been dealing with chronic bloating for years, tried everything, different diets, probiotics, cutting out various foods, and she'd started adding cloves to her morning tea almost by accident because she liked the flavor. About 3 weeks in, she mentioned almost offhandedly that the bloating had basically stopped. She hadn't connected it yet. But when you understand what cloves are doing in the gut, the enzyme stimulation, the antimicrobial activity, it makes complete sense. That's not to say cloves are a universal cure for digestive issues, but for the kind of low-grade gut dysfunction that tends to build up in midlife, they're doing something real. Benefit 4. Liver support. This one doesn't get nearly enough attention. Your liver is doing an enormous amount of work every single day, filtering toxins, metabolizing medications, regulating cholesterol, processing everything you eat and drink. And after 50, particularly in people who are on multiple medications, the liver's workload increases significantly while its regenerative capacity gradually declines. Eugenol has been studied specifically for its hepatoprotective effects, meaning it actively supports liver cell health and reduces oxidative damage to liver tissue. There was research published in the journal Toxicology and Applied Pharmacology that looked at eugenol's effect on liver enzyme levels and oxidative stress markers in subjects with induced liver stress. The eugenol group showed significantly lower liver enzyme elevation and measurably less cellular damage than the control group. Now, this isn't a license to ignore liver health in other areas. What you drink, what you eat, how your medications are managed, all of that still matters. But as a daily habit that's quietly supporting liver function in the background, cloves are doing real work here that most people have no idea about. Benefit 5. Bone density support. Okay, so this one genuinely surprised me when I first looked at the research. We think about calcium, we think about vitamin D, we think about weight-bearing exercise when it comes to bone density after 50. Cloves aren't in that conversation, but they probably should be. Cloves contain significant amounts of manganese, actually one of the highest concentrations of any food, gram for gram. And manganese plays a direct role in bone formation. It's involved in the synthesis of connective tissue and bone matrix, and it works alongside calcium and vitamin D in the bone remodeling process. 2 cloves a day provides a meaningful contribution to your daily manganese requirement, the kind of contribution that adds up quietly over months and years. There's also emerging research on eugenol specifically and its effect on osteoblast activity. Those are the cells responsible for building new bone tissue. Early findings suggest eugenol may support osteoblast function, though this research is still developing. What's solid and established is the manganese piece. That part is straightforward nutritional science. Actually, let me frame that more carefully. The manganese contribution from 2 cloves is real and meaningful, but cloves alone aren't a bone density strategy. They're one piece of a larger picture. Don't hear this as cloves replace your calcium supplement. Hear it as cloves are contributing something to bone health that you weren't getting credit for. Benefit 6. Antimicrobial and oral health effects. This is where cloves have the longest documented history, going back centuries across multiple cultures. Oil of cloves has been used for toothaches and oral infections so consistently across history that it's not folk medicine at this point, it's just medicine, and the modern research explains exactly why. Eugenol is a potent antimicrobial agent. It disrupts the cell membranes of a wide range of bacteria, including several strains associated with gum disease and tooth decay. There was a study in the Journal of Dentistry that compared clove-based compounds against standard oral antiseptics and found comparable antimicrobial activity against common oral pathogens. Not marginally effective, comparable to what dentists use. And this matters beyond just fresh breath. Oral health and systemic health are more connected than most people realize. Chronic gum inflammation is linked to cardiovascular disease, elevated inflammatory markers, and in some research, cognitive decline. The mouth is not a separate system. What's happening in your gums is affecting your bloodstream. So the antimicrobial activity of regular clove consumption isn't just about your teeth. It's feeding back into that whole inflammaging picture we talked about at the start. Now here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. Because we're 6 benefits in, and you might be doing what a lot of people do, thinking this sounds good, but wondering if you'll actually stick with it, whether it'll just become another thing you tried for 2 weeks and forgot about. And I understand that. But here's the reality for people who don't act on this. Inflammaging doesn't pause while you decide. The oxidative stress that's slowly degrading your cells, the insulin sensitivity that's quietly declining, the liver that's processing more than it used to with less support, that's all continuing in the background, every day. And the gap between where you are now and where you want to be 10 years from now gets wider or narrower based on the small, consistent things you do right now. 2 cloves, that's the ask. Not a new workout program, not an expensive supplement stack, not a dramatic dietary overhaul. Something that costs almost nothing, takes about 10 seconds, and based on what the research shows, is doing meaningful work inside your body every single day you do it. I'm not saying this fixes everything. Nothing fixes everything, but I've seen what consistent small habits do over time. They compound. So with that, let's finish with the last benefit, and then I'll tell you exactly how to take them so you're actually getting the most out of this. Benefit 7, cognitive protection and brain health. This one is last, but it might be the one that matters most to people in this age group. And the mechanism is actually a direct extension of everything we've already talked about. Neuroinflammation, inflammation specifically in the brain, is now understood to be a central driver of cognitive decline, including the early stages of conditions like Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. And the same eugenol that's dialing back systemic inflammation throughout the body crosses the blood-brain barrier. It gets in. And once it's in, it's doing the same work, inhibiting inflammatory signaling, reducing oxidative damage to neurons, protecting the cellular machinery that keeps your brain functioning the way it should. There was a study published in the journal Phytomedicine that looked specifically at eugenol's neuroprotective effects. Researchers found it reduced markers of neuroinflammation and oxidative stress in brain tissue and showed protective effects against the kind of neuronal damage associated with cognitive decline. The researchers specifically noted the implications for aging populations. Now I want to be honest about where the research is. Most of the neuroscience on eugenol is still in earlier stages, animal studies, cellular models. We don't yet have large-scale human trials specifically on cloves and dementia prevention. What we do have is a very clear and well-established mechanism, consistent findings across multiple study types, and a compound that's been consumed safely by humans for thousands of years. The direction of the evidence is clear. The size of the human trial data is still catching up. So take the cognitive benefit as compelling and promising, because it genuinely is, rather than proven at the same level as, say, the blood sugar or antimicrobial research. That's the honest picture. Okay, so now let's talk about how to actually do this. Because the form you consume cloves in and when you take them both affect how much you're actually absorbing. So this part matters. First, whole cloves versus ground. Both work, but they work slightly differently. Whole cloves release their compounds more slowly as you chew them. Ground cloves are more immediately bioavailable because the surface area is greater and the cellular structure is already broken down. Either form is effective. Ground cloves are easier to incorporate into food and drink. Whole cloves are easier to just chew and be done with it. Second, timing. There's no rigid rule here, but taking cloves with food tends to work better than on an empty stomach, particularly for people who find the intensity of Eugenol a little strong. 2 cloves with breakfast or ground into your morning oatmeal or tea is probably the easiest sustainable habit for most people. Third, a few ways to actually do this without it feeling like taking medicine. Steep 2 whole cloves in hot water for 5 minutes with some cinnamon and ginger. You've got a genuinely good warming tea that most people actually enjoy. Add a 1/4 teaspoon of ground cloves to oatmeal or a smoothie. Chew 2 whole cloves after a meal, the way some cultures have done for centuries. These aren't complicated. And fourth, a note on who should be cautious. Cloves are blood thinners. If you're on warfarin or any anticoagulant medication, talk to your doctor before adding cloves as a daily habit. The 2 clove dose is modest and generally well tolerated, but that interaction is real and worth knowing about. Similarly, if you're pregnant or nursing, check with your provider first. For everyone else, healthy adults over 50 with no contraindications, 2 cloves a day is considered safe and well within the range studied in the research. So let's bring this full circle. We started with a jar of cloves sitting forgotten in a spice cabinet, and what we now know is that inside those small dried buds is one of the most concentrated packages of beneficial compounds in the natural food world. Everything traces back to the same root, Eugenol, working against the inflammaging process that drives so much of what we associate with getting older. Blood sugar, inflammation, liver function, oral health, bone support, brain health, one compound, one mechanism, working across all of it. The ask is genuinely small. The potential return, based on what the research shows, is not. Start tomorrow morning. 2 cloves in your tea or chewed after breakfast. Give it 6 weeks and pay attention to how you feel. That's it. If this was useful, hit subscribe. And in the next video, I'm going to go through 5 other spices sitting in most people's kitchens right now that have a similar story. Things most people are completely underusing. You're going to want to see that one. I'll see you there.